The pump rooms at Bath were crowded that October morning, with the kind of leisure Cecily Vane had learned to navigate invisibly. She carried Mrs. Hartwell's reticule, and Mrs. Hartwell's shawl, and Mrs. Hartwell's small packet of correspondence, and she stood 3 paces behind her employer's chair, while the women of the season arranged themselves into their familiar geometries of rank and proximity. The room smelled of mineral water and beeswax, and the powder of 24 expensive wigs. Cecily did not belong to any cluster near her. She was not supposed to. It was Lady Murstone who noticed her first, or rather, Lady Murstone who chose to notice her, in a way that named her as a problem to be dismissed. The Dowager Countess was seated near the far windows, in a gown of deep plum silk, her diamonds catching the thin autumn light, and she was speaking in a low voice to the young woman at her side, a pale girl in ice-blue muslin. Very composed, very correct. Cecily recognized the girl as Miss Araminta Crail, the Dowager's niece, who was said to be the season's great hope. Lady Murstone's eyes moved across the room with the precision of someone accustomed to conducting social surveys, and when those eyes landed briefly on Cecily, something shifted in them. "She is only a companion, Araminta," Lady Murstone said, her voice carrying just far enough. "Pay her no mind." Cecily's hands did not move. Her face did not move. She had learned in 4 years of paid work that the surest way to survive a room was to give it nothing to read. She shifted the shawl slightly on her arm and turned her attention to the tall windows overlooking the street, where the plane trees were losing their leaves in sheets. She did not see the man at the room's edge until much later, and by then she would not have known what to make of the quality of his stillness. He was standing at a distance from every other group, his dark coat setting him apart from the lighter morning dress around him, and he was not watching Lady Murstone, and he was not watching Miss Crail. What she did not understand, and would not understand for several days, was that he had been watching her. His name was Nicholas Ashford. He was the Earl of Alverton. And something in the way the Dowager had spoken had pulled his attention to Cecily's face at the precise moment she chose not to flinch. What she did not yet know was that the woman who could explain all of it was dying in a house at the edge of town. Cecily had come to Bath 3.5 years earlier, in the spring after her mother died, carrying a single trunk, a letter of introduction from the Reverend Mr. Dawson of Wiltshire, and almost nothing else. Her mother, Eleanor Vane, had lived for 22 years in a state of genteel embarrassment. She never named precisely, but which Cecily had grown up inside the way. One grows up inside a climate, aware of the weather but unable to describe it from the outside. Eleanor Vane had been educated, well-spoken, and very careful about the subject of her own origins. She had told Cecily, when Cecily was old enough to ask directly, that she had been born in good family and had suffered a private disgrace before Cecily's birth, and that the disgrace was not to be discussed. The gentleman involved did not acknowledge Cecily. Eleanor had not expected him to. She had taken a small cottage in Wiltshire on borrowed money, had lived on her sewing and on the quiet charity of the Reverend Mr. Branney, Dawson's household, and had died of a fever at 44, without ever saying what she had lost or who had taken it from her. Cecily had been 20 when Eleanor died. She had wept in private, sold the cottage furniture, and written to the only connection she had, which was the Reverend's recommendation to Mrs. Hartwell of Bath, who required a literate companion of good manners and modest expectations. Mrs. Hartwell was not unkind. She was elderly and fond of novels, and liked to have someone read aloud to her in the evenings. And she did not require Cecily to be invisible at the table, only to be quiet when matters of standing were discussed. Cecily read to her every evening after dinner, managed the household accounts, sorted the correspondence, and attended the season's events as a necessary appendage at her employer's elbow. She observed the season with the precise disinterest of someone cataloging phenomena that did not concern her. She had no dowry, no family, no position beyond the one she occupied in Mrs. Hartwell's shadow. She had the Reverend's letter which said she was a young woman of good character. She had her mother's handwriting kept in a box under her bed, which said nothing useful about anything. She had, without having sought it, made herself necessary. That was the whole of her ambition, and she had understood for years that it was a modest one. The letter arrived on a Thursday, brought by a child in a rough coat, who asked for Miss Vane by name, and waited at the kitchen door for an answer. It was addressed in a hand Cecily did not recognize, small and crowded, and it said only that Mrs. Dorothy Peel of Lincombe Lane wished to speak with Miss Vane on a matter of some urgency, and that Mrs. Peel's time was short, and that her daughter Hester had sent this letter at her mother's express request. Cecily read it twice. She did not know a Mrs. Peel. She did not know anyone in Lincombe. She set the letter on the table beside her, and looked at the window for a moment, and then she put on her coat and told Mrs. Hartwell she had an errand, and walked. The house on Lincombe Lane was small and old, with a low doorway and a smell of coal and something medicinal beneath it. Hester Peel was 30 or thereabouts, plain-faced and steady, and she met Cecily at the door with the manner of a woman who had been holding something together by will for a long time. "She asked for you by name," Hester said. 3 days ago, when she could still speak clearly, she said, "Find Cecily, Vane of Bath. She said she had something that belonged to you." The narrow stair was steep. The room above was dim, the curtains half drawn, and the woman in the bed was small and yellowish, her breath coming in careful measured portions, as though breath itself had become a resource to be conserved. She was perhaps 65, perhaps older. Her hands on the blanket were still and large, the hands of someone who had worked with them her entire life. She opened her eyes when Cecily entered, and for a moment the clarity in them was startling, as though the illness had burned away everything except the most essential attention. "Miss Vane," she said. Her voice was thin but deliberate. "Eleanor's girl." "Yes," Cecily said. "My mother is gone." Dorothy nodded as though this was not news, only confirmation. "I delivered her child," she said, 22 years ago. I was the midwife." Cecily sat in the chair Hester placed beside the bed, and held herself very still. A midwife, dying, who had summoned her by name, and who had attended her birth. The medicinal smell in the room was sharp at the back of her throat. "I was paid," Dorothy said, "by Lady Murstone." To say that the child had not survived. Outside, the lane was quiet. A cart passed, wheels grinding on stone. Somewhere in the house below, something settled and creaked. "The child was you," Dorothy said. Eleanor was not what they told everyone. She was not ruined. She was married, very quietly and very young, to Lord Henry Murstone before his family knew anything of it. She was with child. They brought me to the house in Wiltshire, and Lady Murstone came the day after the birth, and told me what I was to say. Cecily's hands were folded in her lap. She was aware of them with unusual precision, the way one becomes aware of one's breathing. What were you to say? That there was no living child. That Eleanor had delivered a stillborn girl. Dorothy's jaw tightened slightly. Lord Henry died 6 months later, of a riding accident. The title passed to his cousin. Lady Murstone's line retained the estate, because there was no heir of the body. No child. I said there was no child. The silence that followed was of a kind Cecily had never inhabited before. Not the silence of the drawing room of studied invisibility. Something older and heavier, and shaped around a shape she did not yet know how to trace. She did not hear the sound on the stair until Hester appeared in the doorway and said in a low voice, "My lord, I did not know you were expected." The man who appeared behind Hester in the narrow doorframe was the man from the pump rooms. He was taller than she remembered, or the room made him seem so. His dark eyes moved from Hester to the bed to Cecily in a single unhurried survey. "Hester's roof needed attending," he said. His voice was level and quiet. I did not know there was a visitor. He was Hester's landlord. Cecily absorbed this without comment. Dorothy had closed her eyes. Her breathing had grown shallow and rapid, a change that Hester registered with visible alarm. Lord Alverton stepped back and said, in a tone that carried no question, "Come downstairs, Miss Vane. She needs quiet now." Cecily looked at the old woman in the bed for a moment longer. The confession had been partial. There was more. She could feel the remainder of it the way one feels the bulk of something in a dark room, the mass of it certain, even when the shape is not. She rose and followed. Downstairs in the small kitchen, Hester put a cup of tea on the table and stood at the window with her arms folded, watching the lane. Lord Alverton stood near the door. He had taken off his hat and held it against his leg, and he looked at Cecily in the same manner he had looked at her in the pump rooms, which was to say, as though she were someone worth looking at. "Sit down," he said. "You have had a shock." He said it the way he said it, not gently, not with unnecessary softness, simply as a thing that was plainly true. Cecily sat. "You know what she told you," he said. It was not a question. "I know what she began to tell me," Cecily said. "There is more. There is a record. She said she kept a record." She paused. "She was paid to deny it. For 20 years, she was paid." Something moved across his face, brief and controlled. Gone before she could name it. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he said, "Then we will wait until she is able to speak again." Cecily looked at him. He was a stranger. He was also, manifestly, a man who intended to wait, and who had decided without being asked that waiting was something they would do together. "She may not be able to speak again," Cecily said. "No," he agreed. "But the record will still be here." He stayed that afternoon. He sat at the other end of the kitchen table while Cecily and Hester waited, and he did not fill the silence with anything unnecessary. And when Hester's small son came in from the yard, he spoke to the child quietly for a moment, and then handed him back to his mother with the particular ease of a man accustomed to a child's presence. Cecily watched this, and said nothing. She thought about the name. The old woman had said, "Lord Henry Murstone," as though it were a stone she had been carrying, and was laying down at last. Lord Henry Murstone. Eleanor had been his wife. Cecily had a father she had never known she had, and he had been dead for 22 years, and his name was on a gravestone somewhere in Somerset, and his family had spent 2 decades pretending she did not exist. She thought about Lady Murstone, the plum silk gown, the diamonds. She is only a companion, Araminta. Pay her no mind. The thought had a shape that was something close to fury, but it lived below the surface, where she kept such things. That evening, when Hester went upstairs to sit with her mother, and Lord Alverton walked Cecily to the end of the lane to find a hackney carriage, he said without looking at her, "Your mother. Did she know what she was?" "I think she knew she had lost something," Cecily said. "I do not think she ever knew the name of it." The carriage came. He handed her up and she looked down at him in the thin light of the lane, and he said, "I will come tomorrow." She believed him without knowing why. He came the next morning, and the morning after. Dorothy rallied somewhat, enough to speak in short intervals, and during those intervals she gave Cecily what she could in pieces, small portions of a story that had been sealed inside her for more years than Cecily had been alive. Lady Murstone had come to the house in Wiltshire within hours of the birth. The payment had been substantial. Dorothy had been young and poor, and afraid of a woman who carried herself like someone who had never once been refused. She had said what she was told to say. She had watched Eleanor Vane taken from the house and delivered to her small cottage in the village with her infant, and no husband, and no name to give either of them, and she had gone home and put the payment in a box and lived with it. She had kept the record because she had not been able to destroy it. She had told herself for years that this was not conscience but cowardice, that she kept it only because destroying it would have made the thing irrevocable, and some part of her had needed to believe she could still undo it. The record was in her old leather medicine bag, brass-clasped, worn at the handles, dark with age. Hester had shown Cecily where it was kept, beneath the floorboard under the bed, and had said she had known about it for 12 years but had never opened it because her mother had told her it would keep until the right person came. On the 3rd evening, Lord Alverton walked with Cecily along the edge of the lane in the failing light, and she found herself telling him things she had not planned to say, which was unusual because she was someone who planned carefully what she said and to whom. She told him about her mother's handwriting, kept in the box. She told him about the cottage in Wiltshire, the particular quality of its smallness. She told him that she had spent 4 years managing someone else's household and had been good at it, and that she had thought this was sufficient. He listened. He did not offer sympathy, which was the thing she least wanted. He said after a long pause, "There are things that belong to people that are taken from them before they know to hold on." She looked at him. The light was almost gone. "Your wife?" she said. She had heard something in his voice. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "Her name was Clara. The midwife I employed panicked when the labor went long. She did not send for a second physician in time." He paused. "I did not insist on a second physician being present from the beginning. That was my failure." "The failure was hers," Cecily said. "Yes," he said, "and mine." She did not argue further. She understood, in some bone-deep way, the particular nature of grief that will not be talked out of its own interpretation. She had watched her mother carry a version of it for 22 years. They stood at the end of the lane, and the lamps were beginning to go up along the upper street, and she was aware of exactly how close he was standing, and that he was not standing that way by accident. "Edmund asks about you," he said. It was so unexpected that she turned to look at him directly. "My son, 4 years old. He observed you in the kitchen last week, telling Hester's boy what a copper pot was for. He has been asking who the lady was. What did you tell him?" "I told him you were someone who knew what things were for," he said. He looked at her steadily. It seemed accurate. She did not know what to do with that. She was not accustomed to being seen clearly by anyone, and she recognized what it felt like, the way one recognizes a language heard long ago and not spoken since. Her heart was audible in her own chest. She put her hand on the wall beside her and stood very still and said, "I should go back to Mrs. Hartwell." He held out his hand. She took it, gloved. Just a moment's contact as she stepped past him toward the upper street. The warmth of it traveled up her arm and settled somewhere under her sternum and did not leave. If there had been any lingering question in her about what he meant by his attention, the assembly rooms the following evening resolved it. She had not intended to attend. Mrs. Cade Hartwell was feeling well and wished to go, and Cecily was required to accompany her, and she stood near the refreshment table in her gray silk gown, which was her best and which had been her mother's before her, and which she had altered twice to make it current. And she watched the room. Lady Murstone arrived with Miss Crail at her side, and the dowager moved through the room as she moved through every room, which was to say, as though the room were arranged for her convenience. She passed near the refreshment table, and her eyes found Cecily. Without surprise and without particular calculation, Mrs. Aldridge, a Bath matron of considerable social purchase, leaned toward her neighbor and said in a voice pitched at the carrying register, "The companion. She has no standing here. I cannot think why Mrs. Hartwell brings her." Cecily set down her cup of negus and looked at the candlelight on the ceiling and breathed. Lady Murstone had that afternoon sent a carriage to Lincombe Lane. Hester had reported it to Cecily in a whisper, outside Dorothy's door before Cecily entered. The dowager had sent a man to inquire whether Mrs. Breme Peel required any assistance with her arrangements, meaning Cecily understood whether her affairs were in order and her papers accessible. The man had been told Mrs. Peel was sleeping and sent away. Dorothy had died 3 hours later. Cecily had been there. She had sat beside the bed while Dorothy's breathing changed and slowed and finally stopped, and she had held the old woman's hand, which had been the right thing to do and the only thing to do. And she had felt grief for someone she had known only 5 days, which surprised her with its thoroughness. Lady Murstone's carriage would return in the morning. Hester was certain of it. The dowager's man had come to inquire about papers, and he would come again to collect them. And if he found the medicine bag, he would know it immediately for what it was, because Lady Murstone had known for 22 years exactly what the old midwife had kept. Hester had told Cecily one more thing in a low voice before Cecily left for the assembly rooms. Wah. She had said that the Dowager had visited Dorothy 2 weeks ago, before Cecily was summoned, and had sat at the bed and spoken quietly to the dying woman, and Hester had not heard all of it, but she had heard Lady Murstone say very clearly that the companion could not contest what she did not know. So she had known about Cecily. She had known about the summons or guessed it. She had come to satisfy herself that the woman would die without speaking clearly enough. Standing in the assembly rooms with the candlelight very bright and the music beginning, and Miss Crail moving through the room in her ice-blue muslin, Cecily thought, "She underestimated a dying woman, and she underestimates me." She had walked back to Mrs. Hardwell's side, and said she had a headache and would be grateful to take the carriage early. She had been lying. She did not go back to Mrs. Hardwell's house. She asked the driver to take her to Lincombe Lane. She had a key, because Hester had given her one, and she had the knowledge of exactly where the bag was kept. She had the certain understanding that by morning it might not be there. The house was dark. Hester was not there. She was elsewhere with the child for the night, and the quiet was entire. Cecily lit a candle from the kitchen box and went upstairs and knelt on the floor beside the empty bed, and found the loose board and pressed her hand into the cold dark below the joists and found the brass clasp of the bag. She sat back on her heels and held it for a moment. It was heavier than she expected. She was halfway down the stairs when she heard the door. It was not Lady Murstone's man. It was Alverton. He had come from the assembly rooms because she had not come back, because he had looked for her in the crowd, and she was not there, and he had understood without being told where she had gone. He stood in the doorway with a lantern in one hand, and when the light found her on the staircase with the old bag in both arms, something in his face shifted in a way she did not yet know how to read. "You went for it yourself," he said. "There was no one else to go," she said. He said nothing to that. He held the door open and she came through it, and they walked in silence through the dark lanes, and he carried the lantern and she carried the bag, and neither of them said what they were doing. They went directly to the house of Mr. Putter. Gideon Fawkes, who is the solicitor for the Murstone estate and who Alverton had evidently already spoken to, because Fawkes opened his door in his dressing gown without any indication of surprise, and looked at the bag in Cecily's hands, and said, "Is this it?" "I believe so," she said. "Then come in." She had set the bag on his desk herself, and had opened the brass clasp herself, and had laid the contents on the green baize without looking at Alverton and Mr. Rull. Fawkes had examined the document in silence for some time, and then looked up over his spectacles and said, in a tone that was professionally even and professionally grave, "I will need to verify the signatures. I will need 2 days. Will you come to the assembly rooms on Thursday?" "Yes," Cecily said. She was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Alverton walked her to Mrs. Hartwell's door. At the step, she turned. He was standing very close in the narrow way, and the lantern was low, and his face was serious and careful, and entirely distinct to her now in every plane. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she said. She went inside. The assembly rooms on Thursday evening were full. The season was at its peak, and Lady Murstone had arranged the occasion carefully. Cecily understood, because the Dowager did not leave things to chance. She had organized a small presentation at the rooms, at the request of a committee of the society, and she and Miss Crail were positioned near the head of the room, and there were perhaps 60 people present, including several senior figures of the Bath social world. Mr. Gideon Fawkes was there, which Lady Murstone had not arranged and had not anticipated. Cecily entered with Mrs. Hartwell and stood near the side of the room. She was wearing the gray silk again. She was aware of being watched from the moment she entered, though she could not have said by whom. The room was bright with candles and loud with the particular industry of social conversation. And Lady Murstone had seen her immediately, and had made, very precisely, no expression at all. Fawkes requested the room's attention at 8:30. He was a small man with very large authority, and the room went quiet with the instinct of people who recognize legal weight when it presents itself. He had the document in a leather portfolio. He explained, in measured language, that he had been presented with a baptismal record of some legal significance which pertained to the estates and title of the late Henry, Lord Mirestone, and to the question of lawful succession, a matter which had until recently been understood to be settled. The room was very still. The record, Fawkes said, is in the hand of Mrs. Dorothy Peel, midwife, of this city, and bears the date of the 3rd of September, 1802. It records the live birth of a daughter to Lady Eleanor Mirestone, lawful wife of Lord Henry Mirestone, in the county of Wiltshire. The child was named Cecily. He looked up. The child is alive. Lady Mirestone said in a voice of absolute controlled surface, "This is preposterous," Fawkes said. "My lady, the document bears your signature as witness. You were present." The dowager's fan stilled in her hand. Across the room, Miss Crail had gone quite white. "A forgery," Lady Mirestone said. Her voice was still controlled, still perfectly calibrated, still carrying all the centuries of confidence that had made her, until this moment, someone who was simply never wrong. Mrs. Peel was an old woman with a wandering mind. Whatever she signed, whatever she said, the record she kept was of a stillborn child, and I will not stand in this room and be told otherwise by a solicitor wielding a dead woman's confession. The room was silent enough that the candles could be heard. Cecily had not moved from her place by the side wall. She had been watching Lady Mirestone, and she had seen what happened behind the dowager's controlled surface when Fawkes said the signature, which was that something moved through her face like a fault in stone, very small, very swift, and then was sealed over. She did not need to speak. She understood that. It was Alverton who moved. He had been standing at the back of the room, and she had been aware of him for the entire evening, in the precise way she had been aware of him for days now, which was an awareness that did not require looking. She heard him before she saw him, the deliberate quality of his footsteps in the hush, and the room turned, first a few heads, then more, until he was standing in the center of it, and 60 people were looking at him. He looked at Cecily. He looked at Lady Mirestone. Then he looked at Fawkes. "Miss Vane is the Countess of Mirestone," he said. "I speak for her." 12 words, short, specific, irrevocable. Lady Mirestone's fan opened and closed once. Miss Crail, at the dowager's side, put one hand on the back of a chair. She was not a wicked girl. She was a girl who had been told her entire life that she was the correct version of something, and she was discovering in public that the story had been more complicated than she had been allowed to know. Her face was pale and still, and whatever she was feeling, she kept it. Lady Mirestone said after a silence that lasted long enough for every person in the room to mark it, "I see." Her voice had lost something. The certainty in it was not gone, but it was smaller, and the room could hear the difference. Fawkes said, with great procedural kindness, that there would be legal proceedings in the appropriate fashion, that nothing would be resolved this evening, and that Miss Vane, whom he must now address as my lady, might wish to seek counsel at her earliest convenience. He said this with the measured gravity of someone who understood that what had just happened would take months and perhaps years to sort, and that the law was a slow instrument, but that the foundation on which the claim rested was documented and witnessed and sound. Cecily thanked him. She crossed the room afterward through a crowd that parted for her in a way it never had before, with the curious underwater quality of an evening that has reorganized itself around a different center. She did not approach Lady Mirestone, who was speaking quietly to a woman at her side. Her composure restored to most of its usual surface, though not quite all. She did not approach Miss Crail, who had been led away by an aunt, and who deserved, Cecily thought, some private space in which to rearrange what she had known about herself. She found Alverton near the door. He was watching her in the same way he had watched her in the pump rooms, and now she understood without any remaining ambiguity what that quality of watching was. "Thank you," she said. "I said what was accurate," he said. She looked at him for a moment in the bright and altered air of the room. "You did not have to say it publicly," she said. "No," he agreed. He held her gaze. "I chose to," she heard. Underneath that, what he meant. The same precision of meaning she had been hearing in him for days, in the commands that were not commands, and the attention that was not accidental, and the way he had appeared at the door of a dark house because she had not come back. Outside, the air was cool and smelled of autumn leaves and the river. He walked beside her for a block, and then stopped in the shadow of a tree, and turned to her and she stopped too. And he said with the same economy that was simply how he was made, "I would like to call on you tomorrow." She thought of the gray silk gown. She thought of Mrs. Hartwell's drawing room, which she would need to leave, and the legal proceedings that would begin very soon, and the fact that she did not yet know how to be what she apparently was. She thought about Edmund asking who the lady was. "You know what I am," she said, "what I am going to be. There will be months of proceedings." "Yes," he said. He did not seem concerned by this. "My situation is entirely complicated," she said. "Miss Vane," he said, and then corrected himself very quietly. "Cecily, I have a complicated situation myself. I have a 4-year-old boy who wants to know what copper pots are for. I have an estate and a title and a very large library with a problem in the east chimney. My situation has been complicated for 4 years." She looked at him. "Come tomorrow," she said. He came. The legal proceedings took, in the end, 8 months. Mr. Chi. Fawkes was methodical and thorough, and the Murstone family solicitors, finding themselves unable to contest a document signed by Lady Murstone herself, applied themselves to managing the transition with the quiet efficiency of people who wish to limit further humiliation. The Dowager Countess withdrew to her sister's estate in Hampshire, and did not publicly contest the finding, which was the wisest decision she made in the affair, and possibly the only decision that preserved her any remaining dignity. Miss Crail, it later emerged, had understood within days of the assembly rooms that her position had always rested on a foundation that was not hers, and she bore her displacement with a composure that impressed people who had expected worse from her. She left Bath in the spring. Cecily moved from Mrs. Bria Hartwell's house in November, first to lodgings of her own, and then, in the following spring, when the proceedings concluded and her standing was confirmed in law, to the Murstone townhouse in Portman Square for a period of several weeks while the Somerset estate was put in order. She was not, she discovered, a natural person of consequence. She was a natural person of order and attention, and considerable capacity for managing complex situations, which turned out to be more useful than consequence, and rather harder to acquire. She learned. She made errors she did not repeat. She sat in rooms that had once been closed to her, and conducted herself in them, with the quiet precision that was simply her temperament applied to a larger canvas. Alverton came to Portman Square 3 times in October, and twice in November. And in December, he brought Edmund. Edmund was 4 years old, and spoke with great seriousness about subjects of his own choosing. He had brown eyes very like his father's, and a slight gap in his front teeth, and an opinion, confidently held, that cats were more intelligent than dogs. He told Cecily this within 5 minutes of their introduction, sitting upright in a chair in the Portman Square drawing-room while his father watched from across the room with an expression she had learned to read, now, which was the expression of someone containing something. Cecily told Edmund that she had known a cat in Wiltshire who was of average intelligence. Edmund said he had known a dog who was spectacularly stupid, and he could tell her its name if she liked. "Please," she said. He told her. They discussed the matter at some length. Alverton across the room said nothing, and continued to contain whatever he was containing. She went to Somerset for the first time in January to see the Murstone estate. The solicitor met her there, and the land agent, and a steward who had expected someone entirely different and who adjusted to her with professional smoothness and only slight visible effort. The estate was large and cold and in need of attention, and she walked through it in her traveling coat and asked the steward questions, and he answered them, and by the end of the afternoon she thought she understood the shape of it. Alverton's estate was 4 miles north of the Murstone lands. He had told her this in the autumn, and had not repeated it. It was February when he asked her to walk with him in the long gallery of the Murstone house, which had a good fire going at the far end, and portraits on every wall, including one of Lord Henry Murstone that she had not been able to look at directly more than once. He walked beside her past the portraits, and he said nothing for a long time, and she walked beside him and also said nothing, because she had learned that he thought better in silence, and she had found, to her surprise, that so did she. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "I haven't asked yet." "I know," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face moved, and it was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one, and it was the most significant thing she had ever seen him do with his face. "Cecily," he said. "Nicholas," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. Outside the gallery windows, snow was falling in the slow, particular way of February snow, soft and indifferent, and very quiet. He turned to her, and she turned to him, and he put his hand to her face just at her cheekbone, the gloved warmth of it, and she put her hand over his and held it there. He kissed her, soft and unhurried, a kiss that made a promise without specifying terms. The way a window you have been given permission to open is not yet an open window, but is already entirely changed. They stood for a moment in the gallery with the snow outside, and the fire at the far end, and 22 years of other people's decisions behind them, and she felt with a clarity that settled into her chest and stayed, that she was precisely where she was supposed to be, in a life that had been hers all along without her knowing it. She thought of her mother, who had walked out of this county with a child and a secret she could not name, and had lived out her years in a small cottage, maintaining a dignity that the world had not seen fit to reward. Eleanor Vane had given Cecily exactness and patience, and the particular quality of attention that notices what is true even when it is inconvenient. She had given her enough. That summer after the marriage, the medicine bag was cleaned and repaired and set on the shelf in the study of the Alverton estate that had become, by degrees, as much Cecily's room as Nicholas's. The brass clasp had been polished. The bag was not hidden. It sat in plain sight, between a collection of maps and a volume of estate accounts, and Edmund would sometimes take it down and ask what it was for. And Cecily would tell him, and he would put it back. It was for the truth. It had been waiting to carry it home. If you found yourself beside Cecily today in the Somerset countryside, listening to her story, tell us in the comments which moment stayed with you longest. Thank you for staying until the end.